I'd like to welcome Akeel Bilgrami. It's going to be another deep philosophical paper. It's very brave to be a philosopher nowadays. In a world in which philosophy is dead, or where many philosophers happily think, happily proclaim the death of their own discipline. And what I've noticed about Akeel Bilgrami is that he brings philosophical rigor, naturally, as one would expect, but to issues which are very broad and wide-ranging. There was a discussion yesterday about substantive reason and substantial reason. He deals with substantial reason, not just substantive, but substantial in a very substantial way. So with those words, I would like to give over the table to, but before I do that, I would simply like to outline the proceedings of the afternoon. We'll have him talk to us, then we'll have a discussion as usual, after which I will call upon Professor Alcorn to give his overarching responses to everything that has been discussed, and we will have a discussion after that in case people have comments or responses or questions to put to him, and then there will be very short summing up remarks on my side and Professor Filali Ansari's side. So I'll call upon you. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here and to speak at a conference paying tribute to someone who's influenced all of us and who has really taught us about religion and the study of religion, what he was saying about philosophy. That is, you can't study it outside of the context of politics and history, and as he was saying yesterday, of psychology as well. I think that's been very instructive to all of us who've been trying to study religion philosophically and in other ways. So I'm grateful of the chance of such a suitable public moment to be able to acknowledge his influence on us. And it's very nice to be at the Institute again. Thank you very much for asking me. The title of this conference, Construction of Belief, is in itself an interesting construction, because it gives the quite correct impression that belief is, in some sense, comes second. And so one has to ask, what is it that it follows upon? And I think the right thing to say, and this surfaced in some remarks that Professor Alcorn made earlier today and perhaps yesterday, that and I think what Ursula also spoke of when she spoke about belonging, and that is really, I think the one convenient word for it is practice. That is, I don't mean that in any strict sense. The notion of practice, since Bourdieu and since the pragmatists and all, has become such a term of art that I use it in a much more ordinary sense. And I think we ought to think of belief as being constructed as an abstraction away from practice. And so, and you can find this in many completely straightforward, everyday contexts. One of the set of intellectuals whom I most recoil from, who are writing today, the most distasteful kind of intellectual to be found today, are people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, and they write 500-page books, telling us it's irrational to believe that the world was created in 6 days, and so on. And I agree with many of their conclusions, but But one of the things that makes them completely irrelevant to their own subject, which is religion, is that they don't understand that what we really study and what is important in the study of religion doesn't have very much to do with whether you believe that the world was created in 6 days and so on. That those things might be. So, for instance, if you stick a microphone in somebody's face and ask them, do you believe in creationism? They're not going, say in Kansas or Nebraska, they're not going to say no. But it isn't. But I've talked to people like that, and within 20 minutes they're saying it's a metaphor, and really what they're against is gay marriage or something like that. You know that they what these polls and all track. You know, and Dawkins begins every lecture he gives by saying 80% of America believes in creationism, and you know, and then there's scorn and laughter and so on. But it's not at all obvious that what these polls are tracking is exactly what is being articulated, and that's part of saying that what is important really is practice, and there is in fact a lot of de facto secularity. I mean, you stick a microphone in somebody's face and ask them in Bradford and ask them if they believe that one should live by the Sharia, they will not say no. But it's not at all obvious that it's an important part of the way they live. So that's what I mean by saying that there's a lot of de facto change in religious practice, which is completely unarticulated in doctrine and belief. And so it's very important to study belief as a construction precisely because of that. And I think so for instance in India, as somebody was saying, I think Rahim was saying today, that there is, if you look at practice, Islam, for instance, came to India, as I said, I think in an earlier comment, via Persia, via Afghanistan, via Central Asia, and it got all sorts of local accretions, which gave it a kind of root and locality, which is hard to in any way associate with the kind of Islam that has a deferential gaze on the doctrines that emanated from the Arabian lands many centuries ago. It's just very hard to see what the relationship between them is. And one very good word to describe the relationship is that the latter is a construction and an abstraction from the former. And how the construction took place, Rahim took a rather canonical post-colonial line saying it came from institutions such as the census and so on and so forth. But the fact is that it comes from many different sort of social bases, and that one has been emphasized greatly by some historians in recent years. So one of the things that I think is very under-theorized and worth looking at, and I thought that you really tried to theorize it in a very interesting way this morning, Annika, and that is that I don't think anybody can really deny that in any part of the world where there is a resurgence of religion and so on, which is described as revivalism, resurgence and so on, that the extreme views, what is called absolutist or fundamentalist, all these words are slightly misleading, but those views are held by a relatively small number of people. Now, if that is right, if it is right that it's a relatively small number of people who articulate that point of view explicitly, a question arises: if it's the point of democracy to calibrate a representative voice with numbers, then one of the most under-theorized aspects of the sociology of religion as a practice is that there is almost no understanding we have of what it would be to have an intra-community democracy. That is, what would it be to have intra-community democratic institutions, or representative institutions would be the most formal version of them, right? Because if we could have intra-community democratic institutions or representative institutions, could be demonstrated that what is an unrepresentative point of view of a relatively fractional minority is precisely that, unrepresentative. Right? If you could actually have intra-community democratization, a point of view which is misleadingly called extreme. All these words are misleading: fundamentalist, absolutist, extremist. But I'm just using them just to convey some general tendency that is often described. In fact, in the newspaper every day, is that if that point of view is, if one could see our way to a democratic representative institutions within communities, religious populations, one could show them to be a shrill but unrepresentative minority. But we have no such institutions for obvious reasons. You know, communities are dispersed. They're not. You can have municipal elections, you can have regional elections, and so on. But the idea of there being elections within a community is not an idea that is feasible for obvious reasons. But the fact is that political sociology doesn't have any theoretical toehold on what it would even so much as mean to have intra-community democracy, or what it could amount to. So I think, one of the things worth thinking about is what could it be to have such a thing? Could there be non-standard ways? I mean, if there can't be standard representative institutions, could there be non-standard ways of calibrating opinion with numbers and demonstrating what the calibration is? I don't think we understand it, and I think it's an impoverishment of our theories and studies that we don't have a good sense of this. Okay, so all that by way of applauding the title of this conference and its main theme. I want to move on to talk a little bit about a distinction that Professor Van Ness set up at the very beginning of his paper, when he said that it's a standard post-Enlightenment rhetorical feature that in Europe Muslim populations and Muslim countries are described as living in darkness as compared to the land of enlightenment, of what is now the area of light. This is a cliche. And Professor Van Ness began his paper by pointing out that ever since the Encyclopedists, this generated a kind of dichotomy in one's understanding. But now notice that Islamists have a counter dichotomy, which they describe when they criticize the West in terms of Jahiliyyah, right? Which is no longer just the pre-Islamic period, but now is to describe the non-Islamic West. So we have this vilifying rhetoric of the unenlightened Islam that you were talking about, Professor Van Ness, and the counter rhetoric of there being a Jahiliyyah. Now, how are we to understand it? How did this sort of what is the battle of rhetorics here, and how should we diagnose the two? I think that's a good question to ask, because to ask it is really to ask a question about the sort of genealogies of modern life, of modernity, to get to the bottom of these counter-abusive rhetoric. There's an extremely bad book, but it has one good thing in it, so I'll mention it, by two journalists. Well, one of them is a philosopher, alas, giving our discipline a bad name. Avishai Margalit and Ian Baruma have written a book called Occidentalism. I urge you to to read it. I mean, take a lot of vitamins before you read it, because you'll find yourself constantly irritated by it. But it does make one point which I think generates the right thematic for a conversation or discussion. And that is that in this this oppositional rhetoric of unenlightened on the one hand and Jahiliya on the other, this rhetoric of abuse on each side, Buruma and Margalit call the rhetoricians who label the non-Islamic West as Jahiliya. He describes it as Occidentalism, sort of mimicking Edward Said's use of the word Orientalism to caricature the West in this case. What does he mean by Occidentalism? He means various things, and it's really sort of a family resemblance of issues. But one of the things he talks about is that the criticism is that there's something scientific and rationalist about the West, which there's serious opposition to amongst the Occidentalists. Second, that they have acquired a sinful form of metropolitan life as pervasive in their culture, which is rejected, and the contrast is with organic communities, religious communities, and so on. And the third, and this is what gives a sort of self-congratulatory air to Buruma and Margalit's views, the third is that they are the West is deeply committed to rights and codes and constitutions, which, according to the Occidentalists, is the beginning of corruption, and they're opposed to that as well, according to Buruma and Margalit. Now, all this, according to them, is Occidentalism. This is what talk of Jahiliya really hides. And Buruma and Margalit say, well, there may be many things wrong in the West, but whatever we do, we should not give up scientific rationality and our commitment to liberal principles and codes and rights. This is the defining aspects of the West and so on. So I want to really ask a genealogical question about all this. And in a way, it's what Professor Arkoon has been doing for much of his career. So what I want to ask is, this is a very confusing dialectic that has been set up. How is it that something can be dismissed as sort of hellish and sinful and so on, and amalgamated with all of it, incorporated in all of this, are things like rights and rationality and so on? What is going on in this understanding of the West? I don't think you can understand any of this in an unconfused and rigorous way unless you ask genealogical questions. That is, unless you ask, what are the origins of modernity? And because I think if you ask the genealogical question, you get a better understanding of what it is that so-called rationality amounts to, that is supposed to be the defining feature of the West. On the face of it, rationality is a word of praise, not opprobrium. And how is it that all these critiques have begun to talk of rationality as something to be despised? That's part of the confusing rhetoric. So unless you understand the origins of the deployment of the notion of rationality in the rhetoric, you won't understand why this is so confusing, that things that everybody here might think of as being something to be cherished and praised amounts to something that is, I don't think you can get it. I think you will always caricature the point of view of the Occidentalist and so on, if you don't look at the origins of the term. So let me briefly try and do that. People like Dawkins and all think that a defining feature of modernity is rational belief, and they invest almost everything in their ideals of rationality in what Nietzsche called the death of God, or the death of the Father, as Dawkins calls it. An authority figure for which there is no evidence, says Dawkins. So the charge of irrationality in the midst of modernity, according to Dawkins, is the belief in to humble oneself to an authority figure for which there's no evidence, and therefore it's an irrational. Now, the reason why this is so shallow is that the beginnings of modernity are not with the death of God, which was announced in relatively late modernity by Nietzsche, actually by Hegel before Nietzsche, but really something completely else. And that is what I, in some of my writings, have called, as opposed to the death of God, the exile of God. That is the enforced migration of God to a place outside the universe. Precisely what Professor Arkun was talking about, making impossible theological, religious versions of animism, etc., where God was available to the visionary temperaments of ordinary people, because God was everywhere, in matter, in nature, and in our own bodies. Right? This lay thought, and it's a lay thought, was everywhere in many social worlds. It took different forms. Right? And it is not merely a pagan thought by any means. It was widespread in Christendom, extremely widespread. Of course, it's been written out of descriptions of Christendom for reasons that I'll very quickly mention, but it was in many, many social worlds, Christian and others, it was very much a part of one's understanding of nature and matter and the universe that God was within. And when in the post-Newtonian understanding of the universe, God was given a place outside the universe, nature and matter, the universe, became completely brute. Right? And there was a widespread dissent against such a transformation. Of course, this dissent has been written out partly because the intellectual history, in the intellectual history, it lost. That view lost. But if you look at the dissenting voices, which were most active in England, because that's where the Newton and the Royal Society was most aggressively active, but also in the Netherlands initially, the great dissenting figure was Spinoza, but then it was in England with figures like John Toland and Anthony Collins and so on, and then in the Netherlands, and then it spread all over Europe. It went into Freemason groups and so on and so forth. It was a whole underground which has been written out of intellectual history because it massively lost in the struggles within intellectual history. So what were the effects of the exile of God in the creation of what I'm crudely calling modernity? But I think you have to understand this to understand the origins of this abusive rhetoric of Jahiliyyah and so on. And so I think two things really are very crucial to understand. One is, and this is, I think, much more important than Weber's stress on the concept of work and the creation of capitalism, one of the things it did, if you come to believe, and so let me just quickly say what the dissenting voices were claiming. The dissenting voices were completely scientific voices. They accepted everything in all the laws in Newton. There was no disagreement over laws, and there was no disagreement over the basic concepts like gravity and so on. What the dissenting voices were saying was that motion didn't come from a push from the outside, over an inert and brute universe, which was the Newtonian view, the view of the Royal Society, but motion came from an inner source of dynamism in matter and nature, which was itself divine. Right? Completely continuous with animist views, etc. Right? So the nature of motion, the metaphysical nature of motion, was what was disputed, not the laws of motion. Okay, this is very important to understand. The laws of motion were shared by the dissenters and the official Newtonian story of the Royal Society. What they were disagreeing about was the metaphysics, which is and the theology, which is where to place God and where to place the sacred, as something external or something sort of pervading matter itself. And so one of the effects of the Newtonian picture winning out in intellectual history and in the ordinary understanding of things was that it released nature for extractive economies. Right? So the concept of nature was transformed into the concept of natural resources. That was a huge transformation. And it was the most impressive initial move in the creation of modernity, right? That converting nature into the concept of natural resources. The other transformation that came with this exile of God, as I'm calling it, is that this idea of God, which was Deus absconditus. See, the term conditus means put away for safeguarding. And you have to ask, why is it that a scientific establishment should want to put God away for safeguarding, right? To a place outside the universe? What was in it for the scientific establishment? And if you look at the history and intellectual history of the time, you will find an astonishing set of worldly alliances forming in Europe between scientific organizations, Orthodox Protestant interests like in England the Anglicans, the Latitudinarians, and the commercial and mercantile interests. These were worldly alliances forming with absolutely clear motives, which were fully, explicitly articulated. You read somebody like Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle instituted the Boyle Lectures, and these were administered by Samuel Clarke. Absolutely explicit formulation of why the lectures were being ushered is to make nature available for commerce, and to create also a certain conception of political governance, which of course got apotheosized in the 1688 revolution, completely undermining such figures, such radical sectaries as the Levelers and Diggers and other people, other such groups in the 17th century. And the idea there was that if God was inaccessible, then the only access to God was through learned scriptural judgment, through university-trained divines. And the availability of God to the visionary temperaments, as I put it, of ordinary people was precisely what was considered the source of disturbance and dissent in the pre-Restoration period, in the Great Revolutionary period in England. And this was just there were very similar movements in the Netherlands and in Europe. So all this is worth looking at very carefully, because the political ideological implications of this were that the very same alliances managed to create the following, not merely analogy, it's not just an analogy, but the idea was that God ruling over a brute universe, that's one part of the analogy. The other idea was the monarchs and their courts and the propertied elites around them ruling over a brute populace. That's the second bit of the analogy. But what these worldly alliances managed to do was to say that the latter is just a mundane version of the former. Right? And this was the point of the inaccessibility of God, that if it was a matter of just scriptural learned judgment from university-trained divines, what it created was the knowledges by which you ruled, the techniques of rule and the cognitive basis of rule was in the hands of an elite. So the monarch and the propertied elites and the courts were just a mundane version of the idea that God was ruling over a brute universe, so were these elites ruling over a brute populace. And the knowledges of rule, the cognitive basis of power, was in this way made the property of, made the sort of stranglehold of just a few elites. And we're living to see the effects of that to this day. So, but it really started. I mean, it is one of the great changes of modernity that this was all systematic. I mean, people took from nature before, but they didn't have the systematic release to do it in the form of the kinds of extractive economies which we see now, but which were really created in the late 17th century. And so, I mean, it's not as if people didn't take from nature before this. It's just that given in many social worlds, when they took from nature, before it became systematic in this way, there were rituals of reciprocation and so on to show respect for nature before cycles of planting, before cycles of hunting. This was just, of course people took from nature, but it didn't have the systematic release to do it with impunity. Right? Which is when the concept of nature actually got transformed into the concept of natural resources. So these were the two changes. The creation of a certain kind of political economy and the creation of a certain conception of political governance. And both these were created, as I said, by the exile of God. And these were the beginnings of modernity, not the death of God, which seems to be a relatively late development and relatively, I would say, superficial in understanding the nature of modernity. So, now, there are a few more things that I want to say, and I'll say them quickly. One very crucial feature that emerged out of this was the concept of civility. Norbert Elias has studied this well, but Norbert Elias fails to see a point in it, which I believe is a point that goes very deep in the way we should understand reactions to the modern in the Islamic world and other parts of the world. And this is, the concept of civility is a concept in which, as I said, the monarch, the propertied elites, and the courts around the monarch generated a notion of civility whose substantial point was to hide from itself the cruelties of its own perpetration. And I think that you can't understand a great deal of the politics of the Enlightenment unless you understand this antecedent to the Enlightenment, which is that the whole point of defining civility in a certain way, which happened in this period, was to say that cruelty is the sort of thing that happens somewhere else. Cruelty is the sort of thing that happens in the brute populace, in the behaviors and lifestyles of the brute populace. Right? That's how you define cruelty. So we are incapable of it. It happens there. That's what cruelty is. That's the point of generating a notion of civility as a self-description of, and I've argued in some work that nobody should say that rights are a bad thing. It's nonsensical to say that. It's descriptively nonsensical, not to mention just straightforwardly inaccurate. Rights have done a lot of good for a lot of different people. But nevertheless, I do think that this screening function that I described, of creating a form of self-deception, which I was there in the concept of civility. I believe that morphed in an abstract codified form into the notion of rights and codes and constitutions. That is to say, that it hid from the countries where these notions and principles and codes emerged. It hid from them. For all the good it's done, and for all the justly celebrated ideal, the concept of rights and constitutions and all have acquired, justly celebrated, they nevertheless have the same function of hiding from us, from the West, the cruelties perpetrated by the West on distant lands. Because cruelty is not the sort of thing that happens here. It happens there. Cruelty happens in Saddam's Iraq, in Mugabe's Zimbabwe. It's not what happens here. I think it's the same set of screening functions and attitudes is what was generated, and I think it really is a continuation of the notion of civility in much more abstract codified forms. And you can praise rights and so on, but nevertheless it had this effect. And I don't think you can understand the so-called criticisms that the so-called Occidentalists make of the West unless you see this intellectual history in which these attitudes were central to understanding to the understanding of rights and so on. This is what underlies the reaction to it, and of course imperialism was just explicit in its justifications in mentioning notions of this kind. Not only were the distant lands regions to be conquered for extractive economies of just more stretches of brute material nature, but it was, in fact, imperialism has two very different sides. The imperialism which came to America, say North America, was quite different in its justification. The natives of America were counted as savages. They were ineducable. Right? But in the High Enlightenment, the full-fledged empires, say in the Orient, say countries like India, the justifications were very different. The inhabitants, say, of India, just to give an example, were the inheritors of great civilizations. They were not dismissible as savages and were not dismissed as savages. So quite different forms of justification were introduced. Justifications such as ones which infantilized the native inhabitants as being irrational in the substantive sense of what you were calling the non-formal or substantive sense, the thick sense of irrational, because what they lacked was a certain conception of nature and its availability to extractive economies, to a certain form of political economy, and so on. Those became the justifications of empire. Natives, even in India, just didn't have the right way of understanding nature, and forms of political economy which were built on those notions of nature. That's the way the word irrational was used. It was not the rationality of deductive rationality or inductive rationality or decision theoretic rationality, what you were calling the formal aspects of rationality. This was a very substantial or thick notion of rationality, and that's the basis in which words like rational and irrational were used. And it was the pedagogical and in the second phase of the justifications of empire began to have a pedagogical motivation as well in its explicit justificatory attitudes. And part of it was to bring people up to speed, making them rational in just this substantial sense about having the right attitudes towards nature. So let me just conclude by saying that you can't understand reactions to the West, to the modernity, to enlightenment and so on, the abusive rhetoric of Jahiliya and so on, unless you understand a long-standing legacy of origins of these kinds, of these notions, these transformations, and these understanding of notions of rights and so on, and these exploitative. This is what underlies all this critique, whether it comes on the mouths of so-called Occidentalists who dismiss the West as Jahiliya, or whether it comes from philosophers and others. Let me just conclude. Do I have 2 minutes?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Let me conclude by just saying that.
In fact, you can take 5 minutes if you like. My sense is that when we say all this, and when we understand
that Muslims, amongst others, have been through colonization. Colonization is a very important thing. It came up repeatedly. Mark talked about the class basis of understanding various groups. Towards the end of your thing, you talked about the revivalist groups, the resurgence, but you talked of other groups earlier, reformist groups and so on. See, what was distinctive about both the Arab nationalists you were talking about and subsequent resurgence, as opposed to, say, Abdu and so on, you were quite focused on the class analysis, but if you looked at the ideological part, you had those arrows going in all three directions, but if you look at the intellectual part, the ideological part, you find with Arab nationalism and with subsequent resurgence, the anti-colonial sentiment was much more primary than with earlier sentiments, right? So when you look at the intellectual content rather than the class basis, that has to be emphasized in the latter half of your... and in general, what is very fascinating is that in the long struggles, no two groups have vilified each other as much as Christendom and Islam in the medieval period. No, there has never been vilification. The Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West was nothing compared to the vilifications of it. But throughout that period, the two groups learnt enormously from each other. In science, in philosophy, the mutual influence was extraordinary. This was an extremely healthy and robust rivalry, however vicious it was. That's what changed in the 19th century. With Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt, with the British conquest of India, etc., you got relationships between the two which lost their health. There was superiority and condescension on the one side, there was resentment on the other. The vilification just took a completely different... This is what Professor Akun emphasized when he emphasized the psychology. This generated a completely different psychology. You couldn't possibly have mutual influence when the psychologies were transformed in these ways. So one of the things to understand in understanding all this is that the kinds of rivalries that you talked about, Professor Wilde, about between the two, the vilifications on both sides and so on, they began to get a completely different complexion after colonialism in a way that they didn't have earlier. And I want to just end by saying that as Muslims, which we, most of us, are in this room, you see, when we say all this and try and understand our reactions and resentments and so on, but we understand it in a detached way. We are playing at being social scientists and intellectual historians. We step outside and say, this is how it was, this is why there is resentment and so on against the West, etc. But these are essentially social scientific, historical and historicist understandings of ourselves. But when we do it, we step outside of ourselves and look at ourselves from the third person point of view. But what do we do, as Bashir asks, what do we do when we are agents? When we are not just studying ourselves, but when we are actually being subjects? Not the objects of our study, but when we are being agents. You see, Sartre says, I can tell a psychoanalyst can tell his patient that he's got these qualities of mind and neuroses and anxieties because his father was a dipsomaniac, etc. But if he were to say, as a subject, not when he's on the couch, but as a subject, if he were to say, well, you've got to understand, I am what I am because of, my father was this and my mother was this. It is Sartre says, to surrender your agency, to fail to be a subject. So one of the things I want to end with is to ask, well, we can understand ourselves in these detached ways, but what shall we do when we understand ourselves as subjects? Can we have exactly the same attitudes? Is it bad faith to rest with this analysis, or does subjectivity and agency require something else? Well, I'll end with that question. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I think that the question was as important. The question at the end was as important as everything that you said before. Just a thought I want to put forward, however. People who defend and champion modernity would say that modernity, that the modern world has a particular quality to it which was not present at any other time in human history. And that quality is not just rationalism, but it is that it gives systematic place to its own antithesis, that it allows a voice
Criticism.
against, criticism which is fundamental, which, that is its claim anyway. And that this is, if you like, the distinguishing characteristic of modernity. Now, I take it, I draw a conclusion from what you said, that that is not in fact correct, that what is claimed is not what is real. But, the fact is that modernity, the modern world is very diverse. And there has been a long counter-enlightenment tradition, and you seem to suggest that that is that lost out. Maybe it did. It has a little bit of afterlife in California, in the new age, and which is a sort of decadent form of it. But can we really talk about rationalism equaling more or less the triumphant modern world? That was my question. The other slight unease I have is that
Aziz, my thoughts desert me if I have more than one question
Go ahead.
So let me answer one at a time. I'm sorry, my mind just goes to mush if further. It's a curious thing about you're absolutely accurate in noticing that I have not stressed the fact that the West allows criticism as part of its understanding of itself. That there is this ideal of liberalism, that it allows criticism within its own societies, and the counter-enlightenment. If you look at the kinds of criticisms that are available, it's not just that it's true that fundamental criticisms are available. Let's just take one example of how, if I were to make seriously critical remarks about Israel in public, in my university, there would just be a kind of... nobody would silence me. Nobody would censor me. But there would be a kind of almost universal recoil, except for a group of, small group of like-minded people. These are not the sorts of things that I could get. I could say it on a platform in a university, but people, you'll never get published in any mainstream media. You'd have to find the outposts on the internet. Well, that's just one example. The fact is that, okay, forget about the Middle East, forget about Muslims, etc. Take economics. No subject in the history of disciplines combines such sophistication with such drivel. No subject. No subject can combine fantastic sophistication. I've never come across more sophisticated people with real nonsense. Hypotheses that have been falsified decade after decade. I have colleagues who to this day talk about trickle-down. Right? Nowhere in the history of capitalist political economy has wealth trickled down, ever, where it's supposed to trickle down. There are still people who talk about it as if it's the standard view of understanding. If you were to oppose it in any deep way, you couldn't get a post in an economics department in many parts of the world, certainly in America. So now why nobody senses it? Nobody senses. I mean, there isn't anybody. I mean, people don't say you cannot say this, but they do say, "Oh, this poor chap, he's about 50 years out of date," right? I mean, so there's contempt of a completely different kind. So failing to get into the media, the mainstream media, failing to get into standard, it's just a standard way of making criticism, allowing criticism, but never having criticism be effective, because genuine alternatives are kept out. And so it's not as if they're kept out in totalitarian forms. If you were to say things like that in other parts of the world, you'd be stamped out in by. So nobody denies.
Big difference. Yeah.
Big difference. Yeah. No, of course it's a big difference. But nevertheless, it's not as if you shouldn't register the kind of thing that.
Okay, let me throw it open to around the table. Yes.
Yes. One point to continue what you say. I think what would be. You may probably want to add also the notion of knowledge of the others by the West. In other words, it's not just a reflection of that is where cruelty, etc. is, but the fact that also it took the appearance of knowledge of the other. I mean, the invention of anthropology, of the science of the radical other, was very interesting in that sense, and continued this. Relationship to the others, who was construed precisely as non-rational, etc., which destroys this kind of symmetry that this author wants to have with Occidentalism.
Right.
It's not that whoever they think in the non-West is construing the West the way in which say that the East was construed through Orientalism.
I agree.
Because there is not the equivalent of the science of the West.
Right.
Because these people are not saying, "Oh, we construe you as, bloody rationalist because of who we are," which is the construction of Orientalism.
Yeah.
But no, when you talk about rationality, we know exactly what you mean, because we had suffered on this side of that self-proclaimed rationality. I think that aspect that I draw from what you said is central to what you say.
Yes, I agree with that. It's just a fact that Orientalism came from a position of power and from the privilege of location in a way that you simply can't say of the Occidentalists. And the Occidentalists was, from that privileged location, was described in certain ways, which of course the elites of the Islamic world completely accept in some ways. So I agree with that.
You had a question there, did you? Well, he's not. Sorry. The gentleman at the back, did you have a question?
Actually,
please.
I do have a comment. It does, I think your observations are very telling. It does seem to me in the West that the countercurrents are perhaps a bit stronger than you think. They've commonly, until very recently perhaps, not prevailed in the political arena, but they haven't been quite so marginal as you might think. There is, I'll just take one thing since you've talked about the exploitation of natural resources. I mean, going back to the mid-19th century, the canonical name in the United States is John Muir, but he actually got Theodore Roosevelt's ear, so that counts for something. And there's this very strong tradition going from that, which has over time, of course, developed into quite a powerful, not quite prevailing, but still powerful counterpoint or countercurrent. And it would seem to me that probably if time permitted, and it doesn't in a setting like this, you'd want to look at countercurrents on many points. Nature is one, but issues of race and cultural superiority and so on are another. The Native Americans actually had quite a number of friends, not friends who actually controlled the access to power, but there were voices, and the voices were numerous, and they were heard, if not heeded. And so I would think that you'd probably want to nuance your account if you developed it further.
I don't think that I need to nuance anything, because heard but not heeded perfectly describes what I said.
Well, I think that has a lot to do, and that would be an issues perhaps of you put the matter in fairly abstract terms, I think, of ideas, and it would seem to me that possibly you have talked about material interest, but I mean, I don't know. I'm a historian, so I would be looking at the political dynamic of why things get a hearing but don't.
Let's talk about the political dynamic. So I'm talking about what you're talking about. I'm not making just philosophical claims. I'm saying that the political dynamic allows for a lot of voice, but it doesn't have the kind of, these alternative frameworks of thinking just haven't had the kind of purchase that there is. It's true that there have been great changes in labor policy and in policies of race and gender and so on. I'm not denying that rights have done a lot of groups, good for all sorts of groups. That was not part of my denial of any of this. I was really very keen to point out that this is not a criticism of the standard form of the idea of rights or the idea of principles of the kind of the political enlightenment. It was not meant to be that at all. But I'm saying, despite that, you have to step back and ask what some of the functions, what some of the just the historical function of some of this turned out to be, and what the reaction to it is. But it would be foolish to deny that it's done an enormous amount of good as well.
Yes.
Responding to your final question, or your final point about my mother's a dipsomaniac, I'm as I am because my mother's a dipsomaniac, was a dipsomaniac. Of course, if an individual says that, your inclination is to say, well, come on, pull yourself together and stop complaining. But I think that one has to make a distinction between individual memory and group memory. And the two are often confused, and I'm now quoting somebody, and I cannot remember who pointed out that the whole point of the theory of the trauma is that an individual cannot suppress a memory, and if they try to, it has unfortunate consequences. Whereas societies not only can, but very frequently do suppress memories. So, yeah, now, if one goes one stage further than that, perhaps the point is that it's easier to say, if I'm of the family, it's easier to be honest about family history than if I'm not of the family.
Yes, but you see, it's not really memory that I was stressing, Mark. My thought was that if one says, even as a collective, this is how we are because of, and give causal and historical accounts, that's one mode of self-understanding. But when one steps outside of oneself, one sees oneself basically as an object. Right? So it's not really memory. What I'm wondering is, what happens when one sees oneself as a subject? And that's what I'm saying. It's not obvious that one doesn't have to actually think it along completely new lines, because otherwise one is actually. I think it would be the complete success of the imperialist trajectory if it made subjects into objects and they couldn't be subjects again. That would be the ultimate victory for imperialism. And that's what I'm saying. We simply have to, because it would be so complete, the success of imperialism, that not only did it subjugate subjects, but in the subject's own self-understanding, they couldn't come out of their objecthood. That, I think, would be its ultimate victory.
But that's what's happened, not in this room, but that's arguably what's
Well,
happened
okay,
in other
so-
places. And this room is the reversal of that trend in many
All right, so that's really what I was doing by raising.
In my knowledge and experience of psychoanalysis, it seems that the disengagement, the self-objectification that takes place in analysis is a means to an end. It's not the end.
Yes.
A psychoanalyst would never consider an analysis complete
Excellent.
if at the end of it the
Excellent.
person
Good.
does not have agency. But the argument is that the agency is largely, if not fundamentally, transformed by this disengagement and the objectification that has occurred. Now, one aspect of it, you see, I think what Professor Arcoon does is when he deconstructs, when he takes critical issues with modernity and with imperialism, he does it at the same time with the anti-Western Islamist line, and the the amount of criticism he gives is equal. I don't mean equal in quantitative, crude terms, but it has equal weight. If that is not done, then what you are saying could be perverted into an apologia for that other side, where it is the subjectivity is given free rein without that critical objectification. It somehow gets excused.
Sure.
And so one has to take, that's all I wanted to say, and it seems you agree with
I
that.
completely agree with that. Yeah, that's.
Yes, of course.
Just a remark about Richard Dawkins. I think his writings are absolutely necessary, although
Absolutely.
necessary. First, I have reservations about him. The way he handles the arguments for the existence of God is very sloppy. The arguments for the existence of God have been developed in such a way they have become very sophisticated arguments. He is not aware of these sophisticated arguments. He deals with the traditional arguments as you find them in Aquinas or Saint and so on. So that, I have reservations about that. And of course I have reservations about his concept of rationality. It's very superficial. It's a form of what we call scientism or scienticism, equating rationality with scientific rationality. But books like his are still absolutely necessary. You have to take into consideration that in the United States, for example, that I know better than any other country, there are millions who profess the belief in creationism.
Yeah.
But not only that, they demand that creationism be taught
Sure.
in high school.
Sure.
You have to come to that. You want creationism to be taught in high school as a rival to Darwinism? So you have to write books like Richard Dawkins' books to counter that.
No, but you see, I think you have to write books like that. They're so tedious I can hardly stand to read them. But I don't need to be told that the world wasn't created in 6 days and there's no evidence for it. And that.
But there are borderline. I'm sorry. There are borderline individuals who might go either way.
But you see,
address those.
if you don't actually say. They're 400-500 pages, those books.
No,
and
but
wait. Then they don't even say why it is that people. They don't even try and diagnose why people come to these views. And look, if I earned $50,000 and I lived in the heart of Nebraska and I had 3 children and a wife, I would probably go to church. What would I do? Go to the opera? Look, given the kind of education I have, given the kind, I'm working my head off to feed a family with a bare minimum. And there's no community, there's no solidarity. What would I do but do what some of those people do? Now, if Dawkins doesn't even try and understand the social sources of religion, it's a complete waste of time. Yes, okay, all those things are wrong. It's a banality to say it's wrong.
No, but I said there are borderline individuals. Of course, if you are addressing these individuals, maybe you're not going to make any difference. You're not going to make any dent. But there are borderline individuals. You have to think of them. They could be swayed either way. This is the audience you have to address.
But the audience you have to address has to be understood before you address them with abuse. But they don't have a vestigial understanding of them.
Well, that's a side issue.
It's not a side issue, it's a central issue.
I'm talking about the books like his, not necessarily his.
Somebody buys his
In other words,
Somebody buys his books. People do buy his
Right? No. He would never write them if he would never write them if they didn't.
He is on the bestseller. He has been on the bestseller list for months. Are you kidding?
But there is one thing I want to say. I think it's continuous with what Professor Arkun said about the way people live and the animism and so on. You see, I think that the implicit and hidden in what I was saying, which could be inferred, is that I believe there is almost no more urgent intellectual task for people today than to try and conceive and theorize, for our time, secular forms of enchantment. That is to say, to conceive of the world not as sacralized, not as an anima mundi, if we cannot quite get ourselves to believe that, but to think in terms that are continuous with it. That is, to see the world as suffused and laden with value, which is really what pantheists, animists, and so on, what I was calling, saw it as. It's just that they had a sacralized version of it. I think it is one of the most intellectual tasks of a humane, I wouldn't call it counter-enlightenment, I would say a radical enlightenment, because that's what Spinoza and some of these dissenters I was talking about belong to. I would say a humane and radical enlightenment would want to re-enchant the world in terms that are secular. But Dawkins denies that. I've had it out with Dawkins, by the way, in public. And my proudest moment, this is an aside, my proudest moment was when I asked Dawkins if he avoided the cracks on the pavement. And he stuttered and he stammered. He's an honest man. He stuttered and he stammered, and it was obvious to 300 people that he did avoid the cracks on the pavement. That is to say, everybody has their superstitions. But the thing about Dawkins is that he thinks that there's nothing in nature that isn't countenanced and studied by natural science. I deny it. If nature is suffused with values, this is just the secular version of animism, pantheism. If nature is suffused with values, then it is not the business of science to cover everything in nature.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, because it's not unscientific. It's not. But these are deep commitments of people like Dawkins. It can't be unscientific to say that nature consists of things that are not studied by natural science.
It's also
because it's only unscientific to say something that contradicts a proposition in some science. But no science says nature has full coverage of natural science has full coverage of nature.
It's also an unaesthetic conception of nature that he has. It doesn't have that aesthetic element that many other scientists do in their.
No, but he might concede aesthetics and say, yes, sunsets are beautiful. That would be just completely irrelevant, though.
Any other comments, observations, questions?
Yes, question as a historian, when you're talking about the the allegedly healthy conflict,
Yeah.
competition
Right.
between the West and the Muslim world. What were the useful things that the Muslim world was acquiring from the West in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries? I wonder.
Well, you're already talking about a slightly later period than I was emphasizing. It's true, but I do think that there was still a fair amount of common intellectual frameworks about on astronomy, for instance. Certainly, there was a. I think there was still mathematical treatises which were referring to each other in Arabic and in Latin. So there was quite. I mean, you see, those things are what completely came to an end with colonialism.
Along those lines of your answer, I mean, Descartes, father of modernity, writing Discourse of Methods, speaks of the method that is basically for him analytical geometry, a way of doing geometry through algebra. And he says it bears a strange name because it comes first.
Yeah.
I mean, the elimination of this interaction came later, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, there's transfer from in those centuries. There's fairly clearly transfer from the Muslim world to Europe. What I'm wondering about is the other direction.
Well, I think that perhaps if there are no more. Sorry, did I?
There's someone there.
Oh, yes, Rafiq. Okay, last.
It seems to be you saying to me, colonialism broke the bond of exchange. Did it not dry up for colonialism in the 17th century, in the 18th century?
Did not?
Dry
the bond
out.
of exchange between the East and the West.
Yeah.
I think you're saying colonialism did that.
No.
But did
No,
it
Rafiq.
end before that, or dry up?
No, Rafiq, my point is that you can't understand colonialism unless you understand much more metaphysical developments in the mid and late 17th century. I think that's really the point of my talk, was that the fault line, it's a tendentious to describe it as a fault line, but the beginnings, you can't understand these attitudes which dismiss things as jahiliya and so on. You can't understand all that unless you ask a genealogical question. Because I think in the late 17th century there were metaphysical developments which were deployed in worldly alliances between classes, between commercial and mercantile interests and religious interests, sort of Orthodox Protestant interests in all over Europe. I mean, well, the Netherlands and a lot of Northern Europe, and that's really when a whole system of thinking was created, which provided the conceptual resources for justifications of empire in the second half of imperial conquest.
Okay.